Welcome back. This is the third video in the series of using Terraform in Azure, and in this particular video we're going to create our first Terraform project and we're going to learn and cover some of the basics of Terraform. Okay, so we're back over on our client machine. So the first thing we're going to do is open VS Code. And before we do that, actually, let's create a workspace or a folder to contain our project. So I'm going to go to the C drive. I'm just going to create a new project. Let's call it Project 1. So that's the folder that's going to contain all our source files. And let's open that folder in Visual Studio. Okay, so we now got our project workspace. Let's get rid of this Getting Started page. The first thing we need to do is create our first Terraform configuration file. So we'll create a file called main.tf. Straight away, you'll see that the Visual Studio Code extension is kicking in. So it's identified that the Terraform file of .tf is actually a Terraform file, and it's putting the nice logo there, which is good. So this is our entry point into the project. Right now, we haven't got anything declared. So first up, we need to tell Terraform that we're going to be using the Azure. So we need to add an Azure provider. So let's head over to the Terraform documentation and let's go to registry. Browse providers, and obviously you can see there's loads of providers. Obviously we're interested in Azure, and head over to the documentation. Don't worry too much about the authentication right now. We'll cover that a bit later on. So for now, we're going to be using the Azure CLI in the context that we sign into that with for the moment. So just bear in mind that the context that we use to connect to our Azure subscription and the identity we're going to use are all under the context of what we sign into the Azure CLI with. I don't want to confuse you too much right now, but we'll cover authentication later, where we will be setting up a service principal and a client secret. Right, so what do we need? So this is the example provided by Terraform. So let's just quickly grab these two blocks and then we'll discuss them and paste them into our code. So this block is a Terraform block, and it's telling Terraform that once we initialize the project, we're going to be using the Azure RM provider. So that's a provider that's provided by Microsoft, working closely with Terraform. It provides the hook into the Azure RM API. And then next we need to actually connect to our Azure tenant. At the moment, as you can see, we don't provide any parameters in this. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, we're using the Azure CLI context, so we don't actually need to provide anything. However, if we were to not be using the CLI, for example, if we are going to use the security principal, somewhere on here it should show us some parameters that we need to show. And why am I not seeing it? Yeah, so we would need to provide a client ID, a client secret, subscription ID, and tenant ID. Obviously, we're not providing that at the moment because we're going to use the context of the Azure CLI. So we've actually got enough code here now to actually initialize our project. Just cast your mind back to this folder. So we created this one single folder and it's got one file in there. So let's initialize our project. So let's open up a terminal. The first thing we're going to do is just log into the Azure CLI. And you can do that by typing Azure login. And that's going to take us through to an authentication page. So just authenticate with the credentials you want to connect to your Azure tenant with. In this case, I've successfully signed in. And this is the context that this particular project is going to use. So it already knows our tenant ID, it knows our subscription ID, and it knows what identity I'm connecting with. So we don't need to worry about providing that currently within the Azure provider. So let's just clear that screen down to get a bit of real estate. So the first thing we're going to do is actually run Terraform init. And that initializes our project. So let's run that now. So as you can see, it's passing this file and it's identified that we need to use the Azure RM provider, and it's installed that. So let's have a look back in our folder. So you can see that it's created additional files here. So we've got a log file, which we'll cover later, and then this Terraform folder. And you can see it's downloaded. If we drill all the way down, it's quite deep. It's provided us the Azure RM provider. So that's where all the magic happens. So let's close that for the moment. So before we go any further, I just want to quickly go through some Terraform concepts with you. I'm going to quickly just show you a snippet of code from a Terraform configuration file so we can walk through and cover some quick concepts. Okay, so I just want to quickly show you an example Terraform configuration file. Actually, let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. Where is it? Zoom in. Hopefully that's better. So as you can see, it's all sort of coded in blocks, and it's not that complex at all. So let's quickly just go through it. So you've already seen the Terraform block because we've installed that into our project. So this is the block, it's the entry point into the project, and it tells Terraform what resource providers we're going to use. This next one is a provider block. So you've seen this already as well. In this case, we're connecting to Azure RM. As I mentioned before, because we're using Azure CLI, we don't need to provide the actual information to connect to our tenant. This is, in this example, it's clearly using service principal with a secret. So let's just comment that out for the moment. So this is more representative of what we're currently using. And then we have these things called resource blocks. So this is what's actually deploying the resource. So in this case, resource of type Azure RM resource group. So it's going to deploy a resource group. This value here is what we want the object identifier name to be. So it's almost like an alias so that we can reference this particular object later on in the code. And these are arguments that we need to provide the values to actually provision the resource group. So in this case, the name is going to be RG1 and the location is going to be in West US. And we've got another resource group here. So this one's providing a storage account resource, and we've given it the alias of SG1, and it's got a name of this, and it's going to be placed in resource group RG1. So this one up here, it's using the same location, and it's of type standard, and it's using local redundant storage. So what we haven't covered yet is that Terraform is declarative, meaning that it doesn't care about we don't have to tell it how to get to where we want. We just need to tell it what we want the end state to look like. And when Terraform does its planning phases, it works out the order, what it needs to do things in. So for example, in order to have this storage account placed in this resource group, obviously that resource group needs to exist first. Whereas if you're doing something imperatively, you would say with PowerShell, you'd have to make sure that you had some error checking in your script to make sure that this completes before even attempting to do this, otherwise you're going to result in errors. And as of right now, this particular piece of code, there is a risk. We don't have any dependencies between these two resources. So when we run the Terraform plan and apply commands, we could end up with Terraform trying to create this object before this exists, and obviously that's going to result in an error. So we can do things like add a dependency. So there's a parameter that we can add called depends on. And we could just simply add that and then our reference to it, which is RG1. So Terraform now knows that it needs to create this object before even attempting to create that object. See how that works? That's one way of doing it. Another way would be to implicitly define a dependency. So what I mean by that, so right now we can see that this storage account is going to be placed in this resource group of RG1. So we've actually just named that resource, but it's also this resource up here. So what we can actually do here is we can say, well, we want it to be placed in Azure RM resource group RG1. So this resource up here. What that's done now is it's implicitly told Terraform that there's a dependency. So we no longer need this. So when it passes and does its planning, it's going to know, well, actually, in order for me to place it in this resource group, it's got to exist. And that's what it's done. We can also do the same for the location. So typically, in our example anyway, we're going to place our storage account in the same location as where our resource group is. So we've already got a location of West US2 here, so why not just refer to that same location in RG1? Oh. But this time, let's grab the location. In fact, I've just noticed I've missed something on here. So the resource group name, we need to obviously go to the name, not just to the object reference. So there we go. So we've actually got a nice, clean little bit of code here. So I just briefly touched on declarative and imperative, but what does that really mean? It's quite hard to explain. So, for example, when you build a VM, you create a VM, it has to have a VNIC, and that VNIC has to be attached to a subnet, which has to be attached to a virtual network. So there's all these dependencies. In fact, let's explain by example. Let's get the whiteboard out. So taking our example, let's say we want to build a VM. That VM has a name, a location, etc. That VM requires a disk. Maybe 2 disks, one for the OS and maybe some data disks. The VM also needs a NIC. And that NIC needs to be attached to a subnet. And that subnet needs to be attached to a VNet. Maybe that subnet, or maybe we need network security groups, and we need to associate them with the subnet or VNet, or even the NIC. Maybe we need a public IP associated with that NIC. And let's not forget, all this needs to be inside a resource group. And obviously then we're going to need rules for that VNet, the NSG. So straight away you can see that there's a lot of work goes into creating a single VM. So let's just change up to red pen for a second. So we've got resource group 1, VM 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then the associations as well. So 11, 12, 13, so on. So we've got at least 13 resources plus dependencies to deal with. Now, if we were going to do this imperatively, so let's use PowerShell, for example, we would need to build logic into our script that makes sure that all these are provisioned in the correct order. We have to use loads of loops to keep checking to see whether a resource has been finished to be provisioned before we can link it to another resource. It becomes a bit of a mess. The whole script is just full of tries and catches and loops. Whereas with Terraform, because it's declarative, as long as Terraform knows what's dependent on which other resource, it takes care of all that for us. We just have to tell it what the end state needs to look like. It will plan it and it will work out the order in which things need to be provisioned. Okay, so now that we know the basics, let's apply some of that to our project. So let's take a look back at our diagram. Okay, so where should we start? Well, first of all, we need a resource group. So let's build that, and we're going to need a couple of storage accounts. So let's start with that. So resource group and 2 storage accounts. So let's head over to our client machine. Okay, so this is where we left it off. So the first thing we're going to do, let's just get on and create a storage account. Oh, sorry, a resource group. So we're going to create a resource. I don't know why they, yeah, there we go. And it's Azure RM underscore resource group. I don't know why the IntelliSense isn't working at the minute. So let's fix that. And we're going to give it an alias of RG main. So our main resource group. Have I spelled that right? Nope. Sorry guys. My IntelliSense is not working. Right, got there in the end. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to give it a name. And we're going to give that RG RPG Terraform Dev. So the reason I'm putting dev on there is later on we're going to create a pre-prod and a prod environment. So we want the code to be reusable for each environment. So we're going to give our resource group the name of dev. Obviously it's going to be in a location of West US 2. I think that's right. So that's it. That's enough for us to provision a resource. So let's do that, I suppose. Let's just make sure. Let's just head over to Azure portal. Make sure we don't already have that resource group in existence. Let's have a quick look. I already do. Well, it's not quite the same, but let's just delete that anyway. Come on, get out of the way. All right, delete. Got this one as well. I'll just clear that up. That was just me playing around with it earlier. So let's delete that resource group. Okay, so if we refresh that, they will disappear shortly. Okay, they're still there, but we'll let that finish off. We're giving it a different name anyway. So the resource doesn't exist, so let's run a Terraform plan. So what this is doing is we're going to tell Terraform to go off, look at the resource in the subscription, see whether it already exists. If we'd already run this before and done an apply, there'll be a state file for it to compare against and things like that. So don't worry too much about what it's doing. It's just planning what it's going to do. So let's run that now. Okay, so that's finished. So let's have a look at this output. So the first thing is it's identified that it's got one object to create. It's got none to change and none to destroy. So that's good because we know we're creating our first object and we know not change anything else. So let's scroll up a bit. So it's going to create a resource group and it's going to be called the name we defined and it's going to be in that location. And this ID, it's known after apply. Well, obviously Azure, when we create the resource, Azure is going to assign it a resource ID, and it's going to assign that once it's created. We're not going to specify what it is. We need Microsoft to tell us that. So that's why that's shown as known after apply. And it's going to create. So these little green pluses here means something's going to be added. If you note down here, it says we didn't use the out option to save this plan. So it's always good practice to actually output the plan to a file. So when we run the apply command, we're applying it against the file rather than what's in memory or currently in the configuration. So the fact that we've output it to a file and then apply that file means that we're getting exactly what we want. And we're not going to risk applying something that's been modified by perhaps a colleague in the meantime. So let's run that again, but this time with the out file. I think it's out equals... I can never get the syntax right. Let's have a quick look. Yeah, so it's out, and we're going to call the file tf plan. So that should do it. Okay, so that's now completed. If we scroll up, it's doing pretty much the same as before, but this time it's actually created a tf plan file, so you can see it up here in the corner. So that contains all the information for Terraform to run the apply command against, and we'll provision this resource group. So it's actually telling us what to run there. So the command will be Terraform apply and then the plan name of the plan file. So let's just run that and see what we get. Okay, so that's finished. It says it's been successful. One resource added, none changed and destroyed. So let's head over to the portal and see whether it's created it. And obviously it's going to have done. I'm going to suggest. There we go. Resource group created in West US. Completely empty, obviously, but it's exactly as we wanted it. So what we can do now, obviously we can modify that or add things to it. So let's just modify some parameters of this first of all. Let's add some tags. So for those that don't know, you can add tags to resources. So it makes it easier for management to do chargeback on costs and review what resources belong to which project and things like that. So let's add some tags. It's always good practice to add tags. So to save your typing, watching me type, I'm going to just copy and paste some I prepared earlier. Ooh. So this particular resource, we're going to assign it some tags. Environment of dev, because obviously we want it's a dev environment, a project name, which is our Terraform project, a business area, which is some random RGB services. Business unit is IS, Information Solutions, and business critical false, and out of hours shutdown true. I mean, these are all arbitrary. It doesn't matter, but these are sort of the ones I always tend to put on my projects. Particularly this out of hours one. It's quite useful to have because then I can run automation count or some kind of run book in Azure at a global level, which will then automatically shut down any infrastructure that values the true when they query that tag. It just helps keep costs down, and some infrastructure you don't really need running 24/7. So let's do another plan and apply those changes. So let's run a plan again to the out file. Okay, so it's evaluated the plan. This time we can see that it's got this squiggly tilde, I think it's called, a yellow symbol. It's telling us it's going to modify this object, and sure enough, it's going to modify tags and it's going to add these just as we wanted. So let's apply that again. So we're going to apply the TF plan. Okay, so that's finished applying. So this time it's nothing new added, but we've changed one and still nothing destroyed. So if we were to head over to the portal now, we should see that this resource group now has these tags. Let's go and check it out. So if refresh, so it's still not showing. So that just goes to show that the Azure portal is quite slow. It just reads information off the resource RM API, just like the Terraform does. So eventually it will show up. Let's do a refresh. There we go, we've got our tags. See, right. So now we've got our tags. So what are we going to do next? We said we're going to deploy a couple of storage accounts. So let's create one. So resource. So this time IntelliSense is working. So we want to call it. We want the resource type of Azure RM underscore storage. Storage underscore account. I think that's right. And we want one for diagnostics, and we want a second one for guests. So let's call this one diag. That's going to be the reference we have. So the first thing we're going to want to give it is a name. Now, for those of you that are familiar with Azure, storage accounts have to be all lowercase and have to be unique within the whole Azure cloud. It's not just within your tenant, so it has to be unique. So let's come back to that in a second and work out what name we're going to give it. We also need to provide a resource group name of where it's going to be stored. So if you remember from the previous example, we can just reference this object up here. So let's do that. So Azure RM underscore resource group main dot name. So that's good. What else do we need? We need a location. Again, I'm going to just refer to our main resource group to get that. So this is implicitly given dependency as well, which is useful to us. And we want to use the location on that value. Let's scroll up a little bit. What else does a storage account need? So it's going to need an account tier. So it's IntelliSense working. Sometimes it seems to work, sometimes it doesn't, which is good. So we're just going to give this a standard tier. And what else? Account replication type. I think it's another mandatory one. And we're going to give that LRS, so local redundant storage, keep it nice and cheap. So what we can do about this name? Well, I like to call my storage accounts, start with SA, name of the project, and then I normally just give it a load of random numbers, and hopefully it's unique. We can't go too long though. And then in this case, we want it to be dev and diag. So to help identify that it's a part of the dev environment and it's the diagnostics storage account. So I think that's enough. Nothing wrong with that. Let's do a plan. So let's see whether that likes that or not. Oh, missing argument here. Account tier is required. I've called it access tier. So that's a good thing. So when Terraform does its planning, it's not going to let you do something that's not valid. It's going to scream and shout at you. So and actually tell you where the issue is. So it's quite handy. So it's actually a count tier that we need to do. So let's try that again. Okay, so let's finish planning. If we scroll up and see what it's going to do. Actually start with so it's going to add one object, change none and destroy none. This time though, you can see that creating a storage account has a heck of a lot of parameters and values. which goes into creating a storage account. But yeah, not all of them are mandatory. Some are, obviously, as we found out. So yeah, it's going to create a new storage account. It's going to reference it as diag. It's going to have this sort of information, a lot of the defaults. Won't go into too much detail. There's a lot there. So now let's just apply that. Okay, so that's finally completed. It took a bit longer than I expected. But we've now got a storage account created, supposedly. So let's go over and take a look. So it should be in this resource group. Come on, a couple of refreshes. Right, let's try coming out and going back in. There we go. There's our storage account. Exactly as we named it, West US. So it's all good. Now, I want to give tags on this as well. So let's give it the same set of tags. So let's copy that out, stick it down here. So we're going to modify that resource. So again, you know the routine now. Terraform plan. Okay, so that's finished. It's going to modify one object, and that's, in our case, it's going to add tags to our storage account. So let's apply that. Okay, that's finished updating. So it's changed one object. Let's head over, and I'll bet you it's not there yet, but let's have a look. Yeah, there we go. So we've now applied our tags to the storage account as well. We did say we needed two storage accounts. So one for diag and one for the guest customization scripts. So you've got it. Just copy this block. Let's create another one. And this time we'll call it guest. So it's a different object. And let's just modify some of these values. So we still want it to be dev, but this time we want it to have a name of guest on the end. And we want it to be in the same resource group, same location as that resource group. So everything else can be the same. So we don't need to modify anything else. So let's add that to our plan. Okay, so that's finished. So now let's actually apply that change. Okay, so that's finished. So we should now, if we head over to the portal, find that we've got a second storage account being created. Come on. Don't know, it's just a bit clunky sometimes. There we go, we've got our second guest account, and it should have the same set of tags. There we go. So all good. So we've managed to create a resource group and two storage accounts. Let's minimize this a little bit. Let's make that a bit smaller. But it's a lot of code, isn't it, just to do that? We've got a lot of what's called dry, don't repeat yourself going on. And we've got a lot of values hard-coded. So, for example, we've got this block of text 3 times. We've got it in the resource group. We've got tags being assigned to the diag storage account and the guest storage account. What else have we got? What's not very good? Obviously, we've got the word dev there, hard-coded, and here, and there, and there. What if we wanted to use the same code to deploy a pre-prod or a prod, and we want to change that value? And we've got 2 objects of the same type being created here. So 2 resource storage accounts. So there's actually a way we can fix all this, and we can use what's called variables, locals, and we can use functions that allow us to loop through things and create multiple objects based on other values that have been fed to it during runtime. So we're going to end the video there. In the next video, we're going to learn how to work smarter by using locals and variables and these loops to make our code a lot more efficient and a lot more reusable. So hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.